a lot of the research around work with AI is finding that AI work is often, or agentic work even, is often not necessarily replacement work. It's often additive. And if you think about that, it's expanding humans' capacity for their ability to work.
Rachel, thank you so much for joining me to talk about the 2026 AI and ABM Trends. It's really great to have you here. Very excited to hear your insights about what's kind of driving AI and ABM and things you may have seen yourself. So thank you for joining.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. It's a great topic.
So I want to dive right in with perhaps what's the biggest topic on everyone's mind, really. A bit about AI and how organizations are using it. One of the insights we kind of found from the study is that data consistently shows how confidently an organization uses AI, with content production and microsized ads, for example. It matters more than how much it produces. I'd love to hear what you think, what's separating teams using AI to genuinely stand out versus the ones who are just using it to kind of keep pace.
Yeah, it's such a great question. I think we're seeing AI drive this surge in activity, more content and more campaigns than ever, and more touch points on the go-to-market side. And then also on the product side, so much more innovation and product delivery and product shipping. And what we're also seeing, though, is that pipeline impact isn't always keeping up with that increased output. And if you think about it, it makes sense. To go to market can be really challenging, very complex. And so really when you're thinking about, and how we're kind of thinking about it here at Demandbase, is that the differentiator on where to focus with AI is not just about how much you produce. You've got to really lead teams to use AI to identify what's going to move the needle, kind of moving from signals and insights to actual action and outcomes. And when it comes to things like account-based marketing and a go-to-market strategy, a lot of that is really taking the insights to say, okay, what accounts are actually in market and what accounts have some kind of momentum, whether that's showing a lot of engagement or buying group momentum and expansion in the buying group, and then prioritizing those actions and leaning into AI to actually move those deals forward, where you really start to get to outcomes. I saw a interesting conversation at an event I was at this week where someone said, last year I had 250 AI pilots running in my organization. I was so proud of that. And now I'm a little embarrassed about it because what did you really get for all of that activity, right? And I think that's such a great example of where things are shifting, that all of that activity is not really moving the needle for leaders. And now it's about those clear outcomes that you're trying to drive, and how do you really start to close that gap? And I think with that, a lot of what we hear from our customers is that the gap is hard to close. There are challenges that most enterprise companies have with unifying their data, especially between first and third party data, and starting to really drive that alignment between marketing and sales, the classic challenge of how do you create kind of a coordinated effort. And really also a huge line item in most marketing leaders' budgets is digital advertising. And so how are you also tying that really significant amount of spend into not only this alignment question, making sure it aligns with marketing and sales in terms of that you're advertising to the right people and the right accounts, but how do you start to lean in on AI to drive those outcomes on that really critical channel? And so we're really focused, Demandbase is really focused on helping teams prioritize those right accounts and actions based on what actually drives pipeline. And so using AI to really kind of reduce the noise, make sure it's helping you get to a goal-driven strategy faster, and also enabling teams to really take action more quickly so that you can actually, start to drive those outcomes and measure against them in real time, not, months and months afterward after the campaign is ended.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I love that. I love that, especially the closing that gap by understanding what outcomes to kind of go after, identifying the right kinds of signals, the accounts that are in market. It's very much what we're seeing as well in terms of the report and the data that's coming out of it. We're hearing very similar things that, like a lot of organizations struggling to activate, they're able to get the signals in, but they're not able to take that next step, the next best action to ensure that, they're constantly winning these target accounts. And I feel like that's such an important component now in today's AI-driven world, the buying signals,
Yeah.
they have such a short shelf life, between intent and action is very narrow and closes fast. Yet most ABM programs can't respond on the same day that they kind of get those signals in. I'd love to hear your take on what's really behind that and why AI hasn't solved that.
Yeah, I think buying signals being so time sensitive really actually aligns quite well with AI, because one thing we know about AI is it's compressing the timeline.
Mm-hmm.
Timelines get compressed across production content, across how people are researching, decisions being made. And so knowing that buying signals are time sensitive and AI actually can help compress the timeline around outreach and action is a huge opportunity for go-to-market teams. And I think, what we see is that most teams aren't falling behind on signal detection. People have really understood the value of signals and understanding that that's an investment that needs to be made. It's that speed to execution, and that's getting really pressure tested in this world of AI. And we have a research group here called Labs by Demandbase, and they did a massive amount of research across, a lot of different accounts within our database. And found that sales activity is actually the #1 contributor to moving marketing qualified accounts into opportunities. So once you've got those signals happening, you've really got to get the sales team engaged on starting to do outreach. And what are the classic challenges there? Well, obviously data, making sure that they've got the data. The sales team has to be able to access in real time the data that's showing them those signals that in real time. And then also making sure that when you're seeing all these signals, it can start to become kind of overwhelming. So how do you get clearer direction and clearer decision making in the sales team around acting on those signals? And that's where AI really can start to help. And a lot of these point solutions, these kind of AI upstarts and point solutions, while they're surfacing the signals, they're not always happening in the place where the sales team actually is working out of and living. To be able to see not only are the insights getting surfaced, but now I've got to go do something about it. What should I do about it and do it now? And that's where Demandbase is uniquely kind of differentiated to be able to not only surface the signals and show them in real time, but have them show up in the sales platform that sales teams are using, so that they can then take action off of them. So that speed that's getting pressure tested amongst go-to-market teams right now really requires, unifying the data across first and third parties data signals, and also prioritizing those in-market accounts, which having a really strong ABM program will naturally help you start to do, and then start to action those insights in existing workflows. And, I mentioned Labs by Demandbase. We found that when teams are able to connect a CRM, marketing automation, and also the predictive data, they're able to convert significantly more mid-funnel accounts into opportunities, which is how you're going to move the needle from, hey, we're really struggling to hit our pipeline target, to, okay, suddenly we're getting there. Because those are the accounts that, maybe they're exploring, maybe they're thinking about moving forward. But by connecting all of those signals, you're actually able to improve your conversion rates by over 50% from a mid-funnel account to a pipeline target, which is really exciting. So we're excited to kind of see this up leveling of high-performing teams and go-to-market in this AI-first era that are able to really act on kind of these continuous real-time loops rather than kind of a static environment that a lot of go-to-market teams have gotten kind of used to at this point.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. And it's kind of very, very similar to what we're seeing in terms of that activation piece really being the driving force, and having sales very close to that activation so they're able to take the right actions in the moment is very key to sort of driving pipeline and positive outcomes. We found, something like 6 in 10 of teams, when they're able to act in the moment with speed, and that's with proper alignment between sales and marketing, they say that, pipeline is positively affected. Whereas those who have that disconnect between those two teams and AI is involved, they're unable to kind of replicate that. And it kind of leads into the next question I wanted to ask, a bit about agentic AI in ABM. Obviously, a lot of teams are bringing on agents, and I know you mentioned earlier about agents as well. And there's sort of like this divide between those who have moved early and those who have waited. And the cost of waiting, it always comes very clear in hindsight. I'd love to know where you think where we are in that cycle. Is the window still open? Is it fast closing? Sorry.
I think we're still in a space where there's opportunity for even those that haven't started moving. I think when you look at the last several years, there's definitely a head start that a lot of the early adopters have been able to achieve. But the real risk isn't that people might have waited to adopt AI or agents. It's that even some of these first movers and people that really got out early, they're struggling. Like I mentioned, an early mover setting up 250 pilots to actually get something of value. And that's where an intentional AI or agentic strategy at this point in time, even for someone that's starting new, can really start to move the needle and catch up, because it's really about using AI without changing how your teams actually work. That's where people are falling short. And so if people are able to start changing not just their mindset around using AI and the investment into AI, but also looking deeply at processes around how they're going to innovate using AI and agents, that's where you're going to see the people that are kind of leapfrogging others, and in terms of getting to high performing teams. So making sure that you're looking at this from not just a tactical pilot standpoint, but a true workflow replacement opportunity. And that really requires, leaders getting into their organizations and understanding how work gets done. Yep. And the days of kind of just assuming that people will, maybe spin up some AI and change their process are kind of over. And leaders are really having to look at what are our top workflows, what are the things that actually, regardless of what team it sits in or across different teams, need to work faster and more at speed. And how do we start to work as an organization across silos to really move that needle? And oftentimes what I've found is that people are often, following habits and process. And sometimes the people that are following those habits and those processes are not the best people to do the innovation work. So you've also got to really start to challenge your own thinking about how do you set up your organization to support in parallel working on new processes. And that's one thing that we've been really intentional about in the demand-based marketing team, is having functions that are really looking at innovating around the existing processes and then testing them against each other. Because often you'll find that there's some great stuff happening in the existing process that maybe you do need to pull over, or a human in the loop that's really critical that you don't want to lose sight of. So I think the shift around, moving from pilot mode and isolated use cases to looking at teams that are really scaling AI into their core go-to-market execution are the ones that are going to be rewarded. And ultimately, Demandbase is focused on kind of helping teams move beyond the pilots and into operationalizing AI across their go-to-market.
Yeah, I really liked your point about having the human in the loop, and it keeps coming up time and time again with other experts that I've spoken to. How, especially as you were saying, how organizations have to think about how they work with get people to work with AI without removing them from the process, and accentuating what they do to ensure that they've got the right kinds of workflows happening. It's really interesting, because we also found in the research that one of the top barriers, kind of like AI deployment, AI execution, and usability, was sort of that human component. Like, a lot of organizations kind of neglecting how people work nowadays, and how to ensure that you get the best out of them. So it's really reassuring to hear that operationalizing that effectively is all about bringing humans back into the loop, ensuring that they've got oversight over the processes. And kind of brings me into my next question, Rachel. I'd love to ask you. Obviously, more organizations are using AI agents to make autonomous decisions about which accounts to prioritize and what content to serve and where to route signals to sales. It's a meaningful shift in terms of where humans sit, and also you spoke about human in the loop. I'd love to get your take on what you think about that, and if you're comfortable delegating to a system, or where does the line need to be to ensure that you've got humans overseeing the entire process in your mind?
Yeah, I think it really helps also when you're, as a leader, close to how AI actually functions. And you start to notice, even naturally in some of the work that you might be doing with AI, that there's places where AI really shines. And if you think about processing large volumes of signals or data and being able to pull it into go-to-market recommendations or insights, identifying patterns or prioritizing certain things based on pattern recognition, or even recommending kind of next best actions based on all of the contextual knowledge that AI agent might be able to retain that a human would never be able to. Those are the places that, even if you were to ask a human to think about that, it would either take a very long amount of time and or also require a huge capacity of knowledge that most humans just don't have. And so that's where, delegating to AI makes a lot of sense. I think when you think about decision making and human judgment, that's where you start to really need to slow down and understand what's the decision to be made here, and how important is it, and how easy is it to go to change course if the decision isn't the right one. Yeah. And people always say, well, like, humans make mistakes, and wouldn't it be better just to have AI manage this? But the reality is AI also makes mistakes at times, and so and humans make mistakes at times. That you're going to have issues with both. The question is not how are you using one versus the other, or replacing people with AI because they're superior in some kind of way. It's more about enabling both the human side of what's working at work and also the AI pieces to help them focus on those high impact decisions, or that high impact data research that maybe AI is better at. And I think another interesting insight that I've been kind of diving into is that a lot of the research around work with AI is finding that AI work is often, or agentic work even, is often not necessarily replacement work. It's often additive. And if you think about that, it's expanding humans' capacity for their ability to work. So maybe it's that additional data set that the human didn't have time to work on, or that they weren't able to access, or that would have taken a lot of parsing through and fixing the data set to get to some kind of insight. But a human might have loved to have spent time on that. It's just not really realistic. And so now you're getting this additive capacity from AI. And that's where I really think using AI in these workflows can be the difference between a good workflow and a great workflow.
Yeah. No, I love that expanding human capacity to work and adding that strategic value to the workflow. I think is so important with agentic AI. It's really unlocking like new opportunities for us to think differently about how we deliver value. And I kind of wanted to go back to something you mentioned with regards to the quality of outputs and data, first and third party data, and being able to act on the right signals. Because my next question is a bit about how AI has kind of raised the stakes in that regard.
Yeah.
When you've got poor inputs, you're going to get poor outputs, even with AI. And as you mentioned, AI can be wrong. It can make mistakes. Has the industry's relationship with its own data fundamentally changed because of AI, or are we making the same mistakes faster, do you think?
I think we're still making many of the same data mistakes, but the teams that are pulling ahead are the ones that are really treating data as the foundation of doing AI at scale well. It's kind of like eating your vegetables at this point. You can say you're healthy all day long, you can do the walks and all the things, but you've got to have a foundationally healthy data infrastructure and ability, and some kind of way to organize your data to feel confident in really starting to leverage AI. And I hear this a lot, especially from enterprise leaders who are getting a lot of pressure to deploy AI, scale AI, but they recognize that without really getting their data house in order, there's not only a risk, it's a risk at scale, because while we can make a mistake with data, the greater scale that AI offers at kind of expounding upon those risks is not something that enterprise leaders are taking lightly. And so, I think where we give guidance quite frequently into enterprise go-to-market teams is that, again, if you're going to eat your vegetables, what that really means is you've got to have unified first and third party data. you've got to have a tool or a way to make that accessible across all teams so that everyone's seeing the same things, and also ensuring that whatever AI tooling you're deploying, it's really grounded in a complete view of the funnel itself, but also account and buying groups. And our Labs by Demandbase team found that teams that are using richer data sets, so really 6 or more technographic signals, are actually closing three and almost 3.5 times larger deals. So this is one where if you're a CMO out there trying to make the case to your board or a CFO to say, we really need to ensure that as we prioritize deploying AI, we also need to make sure we're prioritizing our data infrastructure, our data investment, and tie that back to what really matters at the board level or the CFO level, which is revenue, right? You're going to get more outcomes from that investment. And just like AI can make mistakes at scale, AI can also drive really great outcomes at scale if the right pieces are put in place. So the shift is really from data supporting those decisions to data really actively driving what teams do next. And if you're able to do it properly, you're going to see some great outcomes there.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think data's become, or rather is such an important infrastructure to have in order, like having your house in order, ensuring that everything that flows into your system is up to date, correct, usable, actionable, is so important now, especially with the influx of AI. And obviously if it's not in order, you're making those mistakes at scale more. And sort of what we found as well in the research, probably very similar to what you've said, is the most sophisticated organization, they've got that data in order. They're focusing on that very clearly. And the organizations that aren't doing that, they're not having the best possible outcomes. And for the vast majority of it, even though it's something they know they need to get in order, it was quite way down on their priority list behind other options. So yeah, I think data infrastructure fundamentally important. I wanted to ask you one last question, if you don't mind, Rachel.
Sure.
If you had one piece of advice to give someone working on their own AI and ABM strategy, right now, what should they stop doing, and what should they start doing?
Well, this is very prescient because I'm 3 months in here, and I'm going to give the advice I often give myself. So I'll say to stop thinking about success by volume. And this is a slippery slope for many marketing leaders, but more activity does not always mean better outcomes. So, it's a classic situation of we've got to let go this need to measure impact and success on number of leads, or we did, all of these campaigns or all of these activities. It's not to say that, it's not worth looking at that number to understand it as a leading indicator, but it cannot be the final outcome that you're surfacing to the board or leadership. And then with that, really stop running disconnected programs across the marketing team, sales, and even on the digital side. I think too often many marketing and go-to-market teams are working in silos, and there isn't alignment between the teams on what is actually moving the needle. And it often comes from the first topic, which is if you're not actually showing what the needle moving outcomes, it's hard to really drive consensus around where we should be focused. And so running those disconnected programs is an easy trap to fall into, especially when you're moving at speed and you're trying to show activity, but it's not necessarily the thing that's going to get you where you're trying to go. And then I would say, adding AI on top of, the work that's already happening without really thinking about the change that needs to take place in the work and how it gets done. And with that, looking at the AI as a something that needs to sit differently within each maybe function. It's aligning it to your org chart. I think that's where another trap can often happen, where you're not looking at how does this live holistically across the marketing organization. So those would be things I would stop doing. In terms of start doing, something I've been very focused on is really aligning teams around shared pipeline and revenue goals. Hitting the pipeline and revenue target cures a lot of ails in go-to-market teams and drives a lot of consensus, drives a lot of momentum. And it sometimes is scary for go-to-market leaders to step up and put a stake in the ground and say, we're going to own this number. Yes, it's a shared number, or yes, there's lots of different contributors to this target. But that's what has to happen to ensure that you break down the silos, and you also stop measuring against numbers that don't ladder up to things that most people probably don't care about. So that's a big one. I think building that unified data foundation is critical, and really looking at the first and third party data sources in that, and understanding where do you need to make changes or make an investment. And then also using that data to help learn what's driving pipeline and starting to adjust quickly. So a big shift there is just making sure that if it's not showing clear pipeline impact, you definitely don't want to scale that up with AI. You don't want to be doing things that are going to, at scale, have a negative or neutral effect. What you want to be scaling are the things that are working, and that's where you should be placing your bets. And it's something that those kind of quick wins, especially for newer leaders, is so essential.
Scale the things that are working. I love that as the final point to sort of end on. Rachel, I really appreciate your expertise, your time. Really insightful, full of information that we're going to be able to share with people. So thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you, Aaron. I look forward to seeing the report.